Alan Edenborough has 5 decades of involvement with the Sydney Maritime Museum, the home of the Sydney Heritage Trust. Alan led the discovery and salvage from the southern Tasmania of the fleet's now restored and fully operational 1874 Barque James Craig. He has also been involved in many of the museum's subsequent historical vessel restoration projects and is leading negotiations for a new and permanent home for the fleet of the shore of Sydney Harbour, which we heard earlier on this week. Alan has a pre-museum career as a television news journalist and a documentary maker, and more than a decade on 3 continents with the Time magazine. He is president of the Australian Maritime Museum Council, a member of the Council and Steering Committee of the Australian Register of Historic Vessels, and a member of the Executive Council of us, the ICMM, and a former ICMM Secretary General. So put your hands together for Alan.
Presentation. I've got to match the one before. That's going to be tough. Well done. Really excellent. I don't know what we do in the business we're in, because pollution seems to be something that goes with all of our vessels. We can't really avoid it. Steamships are very hard to reduce pollution. But anyway, we are trying. So please bear with us if you know anything about steamships. But we're here today to talk about James Craig. And I'm going to start with a little story, because the question that was put to me to talk to you about is the best place for a tall ship is on the high seas. Well, that, most people would agree that was fairly obvious, but I have a sub-question to add to that, which we'll get to. I'm going to tell you why tall ships are best on the high seas. We were coming back on passage from Hobart in Tasmania to Sydney, Australia, not Sydney here. And it's a 700 nautical mile voyage, and it's across one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the world, Bass Strait. And we'd made a safe crossing and settled down to the run north with the southwesterly blowing over the port quarter and carrying all the sail except the royals on the fore and main mast. James Craig sets 21 sail, so that was a lot of sail up. And then suddenly, from a near clear sky, we were hit by a line squall, a 50-knot blast of wind, the ship now suddenly and dangerously over-canvassed. The cry of all hands from the mate brought the off-watch tumbling out of their hammocks and into the rig to shorten sail. With the braces eased, sails began to flog, and out on the yards the crew fought to clew up the sails before they blew out. The sea began to mount, and within no time at all, James Craig was surfing at 11 knots. It took almost 30 minutes to get enough sail stowed to manage the ship comfortably. But as we ran before the gale, you knew how wind-driven ships, like James Craig, cope with the very worst conditions, and in her case, rounded Cape Horn 23 times during her trading life. That day and other contrasting days at sea when it was just lifting to a gentle swell are why, at its simplest, the best place for a tall ship is on the high seas. They're bred for it. It also makes me certain that the effort that went into salvaging James Craig from Maritime Museum 50 years ago was well worth it. I suppose I would say that, of course, because I have a very personal connection with the ship. It's not everyone who can say the dream of restoring a rusting hulk from a remote Tasmanian bay to sail again has come true. That James Craig does sail again still amazes me. It really does. It still amazes me. But such is the romance of tall ships. That's all very well, but we're here to talk about the realities of maritime museums operating historic ships. We all agree they can go sailing, but it's talking about museums. And Sydney Heritage Fleet can speak to that with some authority. 10 of our fleet of historic vessels are fully operational, 5 are more than 100 years old, and 2 have their 120th birthdays this year. So we do know a little bit about it. And we also have steam in there, which is polluting, and all sorts of problems with diesel engines and so on. So we're working on reducing that, I do promise you. Without doubt, James Craig is the most complex of our ships. Rigged as a barque, the ship is 72 metres long and carries 21 sails when everything is set. Although now discreetly fitted with engines to allow her to operate independently, we were required to do that because we were not permitted to operate in the harbour unless we had engines. So it was no point in restoring her to sail if we couldn't effectively get in and out. It takes an hour from her berth to get to the heads to get out of Sydney. So that means maintaining hull and rig to full operational standard, and that requires knowledge and skills not in easy supply these days. Skilled riggers and shipwrights who understand square-rigged ships are a very rare breed indeed. But above all, an operational ship needs competent crew, trained to deal with anything the weather and the sea can throw at the ship, which means an operational ship needs to be maintained to a far higher standard than a static ship displayed alongside. Now, those with floating collections know that after a time the gloss very literally goes off. The paint begins to peel and the rust begins to eat through hulls and rigging begins to sag. And we've heard examples of that this morning, and Matthew posed the question very elegantly, I thought. And if that isn't bad enough, historic ships need skills, trades and maintenance facilities and/or the use of expensive external resources. The result is that the focus of museum management towards their floating collections can switch from attracting audiences to see their ships to ways of reducing and increasing strain on resources as preservation and maintenance requirements increase and costs escalate. How many of you here today would agree that what you set out to present as compelling floating artefacts have become economic burdens? I think it's fair to predict that as purse strings continue to tighten and floating collections age further, and preservation and maintenance costs compound at an alarming rate, we'll begin to see a rationalisation of floating collections. And we've just heard a very poignant story about that from Liverpool. And I do sympathise because we had a very, very similar experience very recently about whether we kept a vessel or destroyed it. It was resolved, but it was a near-run thing. And I think that this is where museums with operational ships often become unstuck. Museums are about their collections, and the higher costs of maintaining an operational vessel sustainable, and what value does it bring to the museum? For a museum with a static ship set up as an interpreted museum exhibit, maintenance and preservation are essential, but they are back-of-house activities. The ship can be regarded as simply another form of exhibition gallery, although a ship with multiple decks will often be far larger than a single museum gallery. For a museum which preserves, maintains and operates its floating collection, things are rather different. It raises the question, what is most important? Preserving ships because they can be operational, or because of their significance as maritime heritage? If I'm honest, I would say a bit of both. And just pause and think about that. Do we, those of us who want to have operational ships, do we choose them because they can operate, or do we choose them because they're good museum examples and have genuine maritime heritage? I would suggest that there are quite a lot of ships which have been preserved, which probably didn't deserve to be in the longer term. But operational ships like James Craig do have a static role. When not sailing, they sit alongside as a museum ship, open daily for visitors. The challenge is in handling the interpretation throughout the ship. Can it be readily packed up or adequately protected when the ship is in operational mode? Fairly obviously, you can't go to sea with a saloon decked out as it was in the 19th century. You've got to pack all that away. So it does need to be very carefully thought through if you're going to have these things done. It's easy to undervalue staff and other overhead requirements for an historic ship. Quite apart from the interpretation costs, there are guides for the ship, security, maintenance, education staff, visitor reception staff, and for an off-the-wharf ship, crew. Here, volunteers can be a godsend and a money saver, but they require recruitment, supervision, guidance, roster planning, and amenities. And we run on volunteers, so I know all about that. I can tell you it is a huge job. It can be done, and it does work, but it is a huge job to do it. If a ship is to go off the wharf, then there are the authorities to satisfy, survey certificates to obtain, safety management systems to prepare, not to mention the gear and supplies a ship needs to put to sea. So here's another question. Is the experience we give visitors on an operational vessel, albeit in a maritime heritage setting, valid in a museum context? My answer to that is that the best we can do is try. It is possible, as we do, to operate vessels with regard to historical integrity, replicating the traditions and methods of operation as far as modern regulations will allow. But there is no getting away from the fact that the second a museum ship leaves the wharf, carrying visitors, everything changes. It's a commercial vessel making a passage, no matter how short. Responsibility shifts to the master of the vessel, maritime regulations are in force, museum practice is no longer paramount. Alongside, the ship is very much part of museum collection. Off the wharf, circumstances change. And if a museum ship is regularly off the wharf, it requires a support infrastructure which has little regard for museum practice or for the fact that the ship is part of a museum collection. It's an object to be maintained, filled with passengers, fueled, victualled, and sent to sea, just like any other vessel. It's a compromise, and one which requires discipline from all concerned. It also requires recognition that a ship sailing regularly will develop split loyalties amongst those involved with her. Alongside, as a museum ship, those that work aboard and present the ship to visitors have a very different view of the value of the ship to those who are in the crew. The museum staff and volunteers value what the ship represents as history and its place in the story of ships and the sea. Those who sail the ship judge and handle her not as a significant museum artefact, but as a working vessel. And this can lead to crew wanting to make changes to the ship which may genuinely help sailing, but which alter the ship's integrity. And careful leadership in that area is very, very much needed. And I can speak with authority on that. I've dodged the question of costs so far, but it must be faced. This financial year, James Craig will have a good year. In February 2023, our financial year is June to June, by the way, she will sail to Hobart for the Australian Wooden Boat Festival. All going smoothly, a good little earner. She also has a survey dry docking this financial year, which, to maintain her visitor carrying survey, cannot be missed. In other words, if you miss your survey, you're out of action as far as carrying passengers are concerned. Cost estimates for the docking are about $360,000. That's just to open the dock gates, put the ship in. Any work on top of that is extra. And that's mates' rates, they tell us too, by the way. A constant annual cost, in addition to all of that, is the overheads in our shipyard. And that's in excess of $200,000 per annum. Remember, we run on volunteers, so that are the overhead costs that you just cannot avoid. Still comes to $200,000. So with an essentially effective volunteer workforce, we're saved significantly large shipyard salary costs which are involved in vessel maintenance. So if Hobart and the ship's other activities this year go according to budget, James Craig will end the financial year making a contribution of $32,000. It's a very thin success margin. The next year is an off-Hobart festival, so the ship will budget a shortfall of $111,000. We have this cycle. Wooden Boat Festival year, we make quite a lot of money. Non-year, we lose a lot of money. A small positive contribution again in 24-25, then in the red once again the following year. The 5-year budget shows that the cumulative James Craig result as a deficit of some $200,000. And that budget assumes, of course, that there are no unplanned maintenance requirements, which is very difficult to predict on a restored ship open to the vagaries of the sea. It's therefore obvious that an operational museum tall ship with a hybrid role of being both an alongside museum attraction and an off-the-wharf operational ship is not financially sustainable. Without sponsors or significant fundraising, it will always be a drag on the museum budget. And here's yet another and final question. James Craig is unique. She was restored as faithfully as possible as a museum ship and is a very important object in our collection. So why do we put the ship at risk by sailing her offshore? Surely, as an irreplaceable museum object, it is unwise, and some might even say foolhardy. There is no easy answer to that, and in the end, it must come down to the aims of the museum. In Sydney Heritage Fleet's case, we are there to be a living museum interpreting the collection through its activation. So we're stuck with that, but we're very well aware of the fact that we are dealing with an artefact that if we lose it, we've lost something quite precious. Not to mention the crew, of course, but I'm going to end by saying, in my mind, there is no question the best place for a tall ship is on the high seas. However, whether operational tall ships are best placed in a maritime museum remains debatable. Thank you.
We've got time for one question before we go in for lunch. Any questions?
There might be.
I think I shouldn't have said before we're going for lunch. Oh no, there's a question over here. Have you got the microphone to sit over there with?
Is this on?
I think in a way you're doing yourself a disservice when you say that the ship can be a drag on the museum. If you walked around this room and all the museums in here, and I said to you, how many of the museums make a profit from their exhibitions in the total sense, I think I know what the answer would be.
Yes.
Whereas you're sort of imposing that the ship's something different and it's a drag on the museum. It's not. The ship is, and probably using the word museum is a mistake. You know, Sydney Heritage Fleet is a fleet. And the ship is an integral part of that, and it's a part of your business model. It's not a drag on it at all.
I think what I mean, Kevin, is that it is a drag in the sense that you never know. You cannot budget the way you can budget an exhibition, simply because you don't know what's going to happen next. I mean, we can lose another $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 just because something goes wrong and needs to be fixed to keep the ship sailing.
Of your energy costs for next year than anyone else in this room.
True. Thank you.
We're going to do one more question, or do you want to do? Oh, we look like we are. Okay.
One more here.
Sorry, Alan. I thought we were doing one question, then it was lunch. I will just say $360,000 for the dry dock. Mystic Seaport's costs have just gone up. Anybody that wants to bring the ships to us now?
Alan, yeah, my name's Bill Woodburn. We had a chance to talk earlier in the week. And of course, my responsibility is the HMCS Sackville out front of the Maritime Museum. I mean, your talk is so germane to so many of the things that we are rolling over in our own minds. I guess just looking to the future, do you envisage a red line that would indicate to you and your team, you know, this ship will not be sailing anymore? She has tremendous value as an artifact, but sailing is just a bridge too far. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an extremely good question, because we look at that, but as far as we're concerned, it's a movable red line. While ever we can keep the ship maintained, and we do. I mean, the jibboon's just been remade because we had rot in it. We bring the yards down regularly for maintenance. So as long as we can keep up with that maintenance, and we can afford it, then the ship can keep sailing. She's got 60% of her bottom is the original 1874 iron with which she was built. So at some point, that's going to have to be replaced. But once again, if we can keep up with it and we can know when that's going to happen and budget for it, there's absolutely no reason why James Craig can't keep sailing for another 100 years. I mean, one of the interesting things is that she's been sailing now for 22 years consistently. She goes out every second weekend to go to sea. She's offshore. She does trips to Hobart, Melbourne, so on. So she sails a lot. But we keep the maintenance up, and again, remember, we have volunteers, and that's our greatest saving. We don't have the salary costs that you would be using to do the maintenance. So that red line is there, and we look at it regularly, but we are able to keep moving it forward.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you, Peter, for chairing that session. Just realized this is a shorter lunch, so it's all ready to go out there. remember, if you do have dietary concerns, please speak to the staff and they will look after you. And so we are lunching till 1:15 today, okay? Enjoy.